Stephen and Nolan and get us started. So welcome everybody.
Yeah. Do you want to go first, Nolan?
Yeah, well, thanks, Lynn, and thanks everyone for joining us today. We normally do these civility sessions, of course, live and in person, but this is our second time by doing it by Zoom, and it worked pretty well last time. I think it'll work well this time. It's a little more intimate, even though we're far apart. So I hope everyone is doing well during this crisis and making the adjustments they need to make. You all are going a little stir crazy, I assume? I see heads nodding, yeah. Us too. And, these are strange times, but they're also times that generate a lot of emotion and, a lot of feelings. People are under stress, under anxiety, fearful. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen with our health, with our jobs, with our families, with our society as we go out from here. We don't know where this ends, if it ends, but it's times like these when there is that much more stress, when thinking about civility and being civil with one another and the way we communicate and the way we listen. Very important to think about those things. And, Steve and I started this civility project gradually over the last several years. It's had a lot of different manifestations. It's sort of evolved from our own personal relationship, our personal friendship, which started out as two people who disagreed with just about everything the other one had to say, but found that we liked each other and were able to build a friendship, a communication without avoiding hard conversations, without our discussions. And we thought, heck, if we could do it, why not everybody else? So we started bourbon nights because we both like to drink bourbon, and invited a lot of our friends from different viewpoints, different political stance, different places in their lives to get together. And we started out with 10, 15. It ended up with close to 100 people, just finding a comfortable place to talk with each other in a non-threatening way. And, from there it evolved into these formal civility sessions where we try to encourage people to get to know each other before they judge each other by their politics. In other words, to find out the roots of their opinions, why they think the way they do. And I'll let Steve tell you about the session we did for StoryCorps on NPR. Steve's a NPR radio host in the morning in Detroit. And I'll let him tell you about that little project we did and how it sort of got us to here.
Yeah. So like Nolan was saying, for us, this has developed over about a decade, knowing each other and working together and becoming friends despite all of the odds, right? I think both of us can talk about the experiences we have with other friends of ours who consistently say, I can't believe you're friends with that guy. I can't believe you get along with that guy. And there is something kind of unlikely about it, because let's be honest, how many of us actually can say that we're friends with somebody who we really disagree with, who we just see so much of the world really differently than. I wanted us to be able to capture that and kind of capture how and why that happened. And so when StoryCorps, which is an NPR project, came to Detroit a couple of years ago, I signed Nolan and I up. Most people were signing up their relatives, their spouses, and stuff like that, to go in and talk about their relationships. I said, I'm gonna go down there with Nolan. And we sat for an hour and talked about not what we disagreed about, which we both of us are very clear about. I mean, we know the things we don't have in common. I wanted us to talk about where it all came from. I wanted us to talk about why we believe the things that we do and where we got it. And so for an hour, we sat and didn't talk about our disagreements, but talked about who we were and tried to understand why each of us believes the things that we do. And it was a really interesting kind of revelatory experience. I mean, once you sit with somebody and hear where they're coming from, really where they're coming from, I think it's really hard to hold on to these kind of hard divisions that we develop about people and say, well, that person believes this thing, so my reaction has to be this. I think when you hear about why somebody believes what they believe, you start to understand better about where they're coming from. The other thing that happened during that session, and this was not necessarily a surprise, but it was kind of the thing that I was trying to get us to, is you learn about things that that you do have in common. You learn that you both actually want many of the same things for the world, and from a public policy standpoint, you just happen to think that those things can come about in different ways. And I think that's an incredibly powerful part of being able to be civil, is respecting that the person you're talking to who you disagree with isn't necessarily stupid or evil or ill-intentioned. They just see it differently, and they want the same things you do in many cases. They just don't think that the way that you think they can happen is the way that they will happen. And so from there, we kind of started thinking bigger about the idea of this project and sharing it with more people, and asking other people to do the same thing, to be able to sit down with one another and actually talk about why they believe the things that they do, and share where those points of view come from, what experiences help shape the things that you believe. And that was kind of where the Civility Project was born. We did this last year with a number of different groups, asking them to talk with each other about where they're from, what they believe, rather than what they disagree on. And if you think about what we're going through right now, if you think about the presidential election that was well underway before all of this happened, I mean, we can see how desperate the need is to be able to do that, and that not enough of us find the opportunities to be able to do that with people we really disagree with, and be able to say, look, our relationship doesn't have to be about the things we disagree about. It can actually go beyond that. And so we're doing this with a number of other institutions this year. Delta is, like Nolan said, our second virtual.
And our sponsor, by the way.
And our sponsor as well, making sure that we're able to do it with others. Yes, of course, we really appreciate that. So we're looking forward to talking.
So why don't you guys start by defining how you see civility in general, and then maybe take that into a conversation about how we build civility, and then we can go into the whole crisis situation from there.
Yeah, and I guess, you know, when people think about civility, they think, oh, it's being nice and being kind and holding back your thoughts and your words. That's not at all how Steve and I conduct ourselves. I mean, we get loud, we get angry, but we approach any conversation we have and any disagreement we have, whether it's public or private, whether it's on television or not, we approach it with this idea that it's okay for us to disagree. We're not going to hurt each other's feelings. We're not going to break the relationship. We're going to hash it out and argue it out and walk away still in the same place we were when we came up. We're not going to personalize it. And that's one thing I wanted to add to what Steve said, is that what I learned from StoryCorps is that this tendency to assign negative qualities to anyone who holds a different opinion than you do or we do is growing. It's sort of growing in its commonplace in society today. And what we came to the conclusion is different people, good people, can look at the same set of facts and come to a different conclusion on what the solution should be, what the approach to solving this problem could be, based on their own values and experience. They apply their own values and experience to the issue, and can come up with a different opinion, and it doesn't make them evil. It doesn't make them stupid. It doesn't make them all that much different than you. But I realized during that story care session, Steve came from a completely different background than I did. And he's applying different experiences, different values to his decision making and to his approach to problem solving. And so I respected that. And I think that's the start of civility. Respect people for being people first, not, absent their politics or what you think about their politics, because somebody can have a radically different political worldview than you and still be a good, decent person and still want the best for their families, for their communities, for their country. It's not all just black and white. There's good and there's evil. Everybody has different perceptions of that. And I think we should be mindful of that and respectful of that. And so that's why we started the Civility Project by putting people together who were different and said, don't fight, don't talk about politics, figure out who you are. Get a comfort level first, understand where the person is coming from first. And I would encourage you all to do that. If you could find someone amongst your group of acquaintances who you've been maybe reluctant to have a tough conversation with, sit down and just talk to them about where they come from and explain where you come from. But don't just talk, listen. Make sure you're hearing what they have to say.
Yeah. So I talk about a couple of principles that I think define civility and civil conversations, and I think that as we've gone through this, I mean, they've just kind of proven themselves over and over as kind of the bedrock of the way that Nolan and I are able to maintain both a friendship and a professional relationship, even though we disagree. But I also want to make it really clear, like Nolan did, we're not talking about being nice. We're not talking about avoiding conflict. If anything, the whole idea here is to lean into the things that you disagree on. It is to lean into the idea that people disagree and have different points of view. And it is the idea of airing those things that you believe most passionately with somebody who might disagree. This isn't about backing down. This isn't about accommodating anybody. It's about being able to express yourself and what you believe, without coming to blows. And I also, as somebody who's whose life experience has taught me about the value of pushback, the value of standing up for yourself, and that you have to. I would never suggest that anybody has to be quote unquote civil in the face of the threat of violence or the threat of oppression or the threat of rights violations. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about how we deal with each other in the communities where we live and work.
And families.
And families, that's right. The people we see and deal with all the time. How do you make sure that you can actually have a dialogue? And so again, these principles that I think are the bedrock here. The first is listening. And when we say listening, we mean something really different than I think a lot of people mean when they say listen. When you're in a conversation or an argument with somebody, I think there's a real tendency, and I find myself doing this sometimes, to be listening for the opportunity to jump back in with what you want to say, right? I'm listening to Nolan, but I'm really just thinking of how am I going to come back at what he's saying. And that's not listening. That's not hearing. You really do have to sort of suppress your own thought about you and start to really try to listen to what the other person is saying and really hear what they're saying and really think about what they're saying before you come back and say something else. And it's something that takes time, I think, and practice, because again, I think our instinct often is to be in an exchange and be thinking, well, the next thing I'm going to say is this, and that's going to shut that guy up because I know he's wrong. The other thing that I think is really important, and this is testament to the longevity that we've been able to draw out of this relationship, is neither one of us ever leaves the conversation and says, well, that's it. I'm done with that guy. I'm not talking to him anymore. I don't want to see him. I don't want to have an argument with him. I don't want to work with him. There's always tomorrow or the next day. There's always that other opportunity to continue the conversation. And sometimes you do have to stop because you're not getting anywhere and people get upset and heated. And you got to say, all right, we'll talk again some other time. But there is that commitment to saying, I'm going to stay in this, and I'm going to stay as a partner in this, and commit to the idea that we have to be able to disagree without being disagreeable, without it evolving to the point where we're not really talking. And then the other thing I always think is important is, again, that idea of difficulty. Too often, I think we define civility as just being able to get along and not deal with conflict. And the truth is, if it feels easy, if it feels like it's not that big a deal, that you don't have to talk to that other person about these difficult things, and so that is the way to get along, then you're actually not doing it right. It is difficult. It is sometimes frustrating, and sometimes you get angry. If you really are engaging with somebody who sees things differently from you, all of those feelings are normal. All of those feelings are part of it. The question is how you respond to it, and how you don't make it personal, how you don't make it a game ender, you don't make it a shouting match. But it isn't something you just sit around and do and think, well, this is just great, and there's never any emotional consequence. There are, and in fact, I would argue that there are more for relationships like this than there are for relationships where you agree on almost everything. This is harder to do, but it is also worth it, because the value of being able to have that exchange, I think, makes your positions better. It makes you think more clearly about what you actually believe and why you believe it. But it also helps move the dialogue to a space where you can come up with solutions, where you can find common ground about things without having those emotions come along and really just destroy the whole relationship. It is this kind of tricky balance between feeling something very strongly and knowing how to express it in a way that does not break or damage the relationship.
I've been in the opinion business. May 1st will be 20 years. I've been editorial page editor. And from day one, I approach this with the notion that I may not always be right. And I'm always trying to check my assumptions, reevaluate what I think it is I believe within my sort of ideological background. I find there's a lot of room to adjust. And if you're constantly questioning yourself, constantly assuming that there's a good possibility you could be wrong, it sort of helps get you to a stronger position. As Steve said, you're challenging your own opinion and strengthening you may, oftentimes in conversations like these, I admit to myself, I didn't have that quite right. And it's useful. And for a long time, Steve was at the Free Press while I was at the News in the same position. And it was a very useful thing to have that pushback, that check, if you will, So you could say, well, that's an area I didn't consider. That's a piece of this I didn't consider. I was wrong about that. Now, I never start any conversation with Steve thinking I'm going to convert him. And I know he doesn't. I mean, that's not going to happen. He's too hard-headed. I'm not going to convert him. But that's not what it's all about. Because if you're trying to convert, you're not listening, and you're not learning, if you will, because you're refusing to accept anything that person says. Might be okay, might be right. And so I would add to what Steve said. Don't try to convert the person you're talking to, and don't approach it with a smugness, a self-righteousness that you're the one who's right and you're just being tolerant and listening to what this ignorant person has to say. Approach it in that spirit that you might learn something here. You might learn something that, because you're hearing it from someone with a different perspective, you might learn something that helps you. And, you know, as Steve said, it's not the easiest, these aren't the easiest relationships to have. But if you're only talking, if you're only close to the people who feel like you do, who think like you do, who share your beliefs, and you can slap each other in the back and say, my, aren't we smart? It's a less rich life than it is if you open yourself up to a broader range of people who think in a lot different ways, perhaps, than you think. I think it helps you understand. And, you know, we'll talk about the macro level of this in a minute, but ultimately it's where we need to get as a nation with our leadership and what have you, to that point where we can consider the other side's opinion and work toward consensus and compromise, because those are two words that have been lost in the leadership in this country. We have two parties who have dug themselves in on either side of the perspective, and getting them to the middle is impossible because they will not talk to each other with any sense of civility. Some of the messages I see from the, political operatives and the way they characterize the opponents on the other side of the aisle, whether it's Republican or Democrat, I think it's so harmful and so unnecessary, because you're not selling ideas, you're selling fear. And I think if we can, on a macro level, practice this respect in conversation and this understanding that it's not about good and evil, it's about two different sets of ideas. And how do we get to a place where we can build compromise and consensus to move us ahead and to move us forward. And, I've just been appalled at what I've seen over the last few weeks from both sides on this during this outbreak, and the demonization of each other and the opportunism that's going on here. Instead of just coming together and saying, this is what people want, is a spirit of unity and a spirit that we're pushing ahead and working together to solve this. Watching these petty political fights go on all day long, it's just it adds so much to the anxiety and stress. And so on a macro level, if we could learn in our personal relationships to be civil and to be a little more accepting of other people's ideas, maybe on a macro level, we can come to the place where we can build consensus and we can get some things done, because a lot of things need to get done.
This is such a great intro, and I definitely want to hear from everybody who's here. So maybe you guys can then use this next couple of minutes to talk about how obviously it's hard to build civility in normal times, and we're facing this pandemic. It's scary, and we don't have concrete information about much. And so how do we then try to build civility at a time like this, when we're all worried and scared about what's happening, and why should we at a time like this?
Well, I think we need to be open to other ideas, particularly in a time like this. And there are we don't know what the right answer to this crisis is. We're feeling our way through because we've never faced anything like this. And so I think it's dangerous to lock into one set of ideas, one set of solutions, and not consider other ideas. And we know across this country, a lot across this world, there are a lot of different models being applied to attacking and combating. And that's a good thing, because we want to explore as many different ideas as we can to find the one that works. But I have found, if you don't lock in right to today's accepted approach and answers, the hostility is enormous. But there are lots of things to consider here, and lots of different approaches. We need to be open to discussing all of them.
Yeah, and I think it's also, you know, again, trying to understand where everyone is coming from. There is nobody right now who is not scared.
Right.
There is nobody right now who isn't experiencing real sadness and loss. And one of the things that's been interesting to me is that, you know, people express those feelings and reactions to those feelings really differently, and sometimes that becomes a source of friction. That becomes the source of an argument or a dispute, is because you don't have somebody who is expressing those things the way you think they ought to, or in a way that's clear to you that that's what's going on with them. You know, the patience that's required right now with people and their reactions to this is part of the key to, I think, being able to talk more productively about what's going on. You know, it isn't that fundamentally different than when we aren't in a pandemic. The principles of how you have to approach, you know, people who are saying or doing things that you find, you know, yourself at odds with, or even that you find offensive. I mean, there's things that people are saying or suggesting or talking about that I think it's perfectly reasonable to be offended by. But then the question again is, why is it that you think that person believes those things? Why are they advocating for those things at this time? And trying to understand where they're coming from, as opposed to just reacting to it. And it's hard. It's harder now than it is in other times, because the stakes literally here are life and death for so many people.
And I would just say that I agree. Everybody's scared. I certainly am, and I know everybody I know. We're frightened, but not everybody is frightened about the same thing. And you know, a lot of people are. I think most people are legitimately scared about the health aspects, but you have a lot of people also worried about what's going to happen to their jobs and their ability to support themselves and their family. And that becomes paramount in their minds when you have particularly young people, you know, with young families and mortgages just getting started, and they're looking at losing their job and knowing there's probably no place else they're going to get a job in this environment. That rises maybe to a level of greater concern than even their health, because particularly, you know, people who have other people dependent on them. And you can't dismiss that. And I see so many messages of, oh, you know, we're all going to die and you're worried about people's jobs. I'm saying, you know, a lot of people, particularly this week, are getting notices, you know, your job's gone because of this. And now, along with their health, they got to worry about health care. What's going to happen with my health insurance? What's going to happen to my ability to pay my mortgage? What's going to happen? I got kids in college. Am I going to be able to send them back? These are very legitimate worries. And to simply dismiss them as people being insensitive to the health risk, you know, I think that is giving people, that's a discredit to people who are terrified about how they're going to be able to support themselves coming out of this. And that's at all levels of the economic scale, I think.
So Lisa has a question.
Yeah.
What
Which
are some strategies?
Raise your hand. Okay, Lisa.
So what are some strategies you have found to be successful in diffusing a hostile conversation?
Well, we don't necessarily always try to diffuse it.
Right? Sometimes we lean into it. So, I mean, again, I think all the tools that we've been talking about, you know, trying to put yourself in a position of listening, of really listening to the other person. You know, what is this person actually trying to say? What does this person actually believe, and why do they believe it, as opposed to reacting to how different what they're saying is from the way you feel or the way you think. I think that's a huge part of it. And I also think it's okay, I think it was really different early on when I first came back to Detroit in the late O's and met Nolan, and we started having these exchanges in professional settings. It was really different, and I think there were different kinds of reactions that both of us had to those differences. Giving things time. It looks really different now when we have a disagreement than it did 10 years ago. But it's been allowed to do that because neither one of us said, forget it. I am not dealing with this person anymore. I'm not going to deal with somebody who I don't agree with. Hostility is an interesting concept and word, and I certainly don't want to suggest that anybody has to deal with somebody who seems threatening or degrading or anything like that. I think it's okay to walk away from those kinds of situations. It's also okay to walk away for a specific period of time, right? To say, we can't get any further right now because I feel too heated and I think you are too heated, and we'll talk again. It's okay to do that. It's okay to exit as a way of removing some of the heat, I guess, from the situation. But again, it's about.
I would say, Steve, if I could add, walk away from the issue, but not each other. Change the subject. Find that thing that you can talk about until you calm down enough to take on the contentious issue.
Yeah.
Let me just interject one thing, and then we have two other really good questions waiting. So right now, everybody's sheltering in place, and a lot of these conversations or this hostility is coming up in a virtual space. So you don't have the benefit of being face to face with someone and seeing the humanity in their eyes and relating in that way. So we're a lot braver and I would say meaner online than we might be face to face with someone. So how can people respond if you see somebody posting something that's just really angers you, or you feel is just so misguided and it's threatening in some way? How do you address it in this space right now when we don't have the opportunity to be face to face?
Well, I mean, quite often, even before this, I was dealing with, with the people over email and what have you, and people write in and say, "Oh, you're an idiot, you're a jerk, you're whatever." And I find in a lot of places, a lot of cases, if I can just write back a letter, addressing what I perceive as their issue without repeating, without mimicking their nastiness, it calms things down a little. And, I've had cases where somebody say, "Oh, you're an idiot." And I'll come back, "Well, here's why I said what I said." And they'll come back and say, "Well, you're still an idiot, but what about this?" And then I'll answer again. After 3 or 4 exchanges, we're having a civil conversation about our disagreements rather than personalizing it. And I would just urge, don't get drawn into making things personal.
And also social media, I think, it's this wonderful connector. And, I marvel all the time at the things that we're capable of doing and the ways that we're capable of interacting with each other that, just 2 or 3 years ago weren't possible. I mean, we're sitting on a digital conferencing tool right now that I think most of us probably couldn't imagine 5 or 10 years ago.
2 weeks ago.
Yeah, right. Now this is our lives. But I also think that pause before you respond, taking a deep breath and saying, okay, this person is saying something I think is either monumentally stupid or outrageous or offensive or whatever, and saying, but I'm not going to react right this second to it. I'm going to think about it. I'm going to take some time and actually think about what they're saying, why they're saying it, and how I can respond in a way that doesn't escalate. Like Nolan was saying, we get a lot of feedback from people, and it's often negative. It's often aggressive, and meant to offend or harm. And I think pausing before you just push back, pausing before you jump in and make it worse, sometimes makes a big difference. It makes a big difference in the way that you process it, but it also makes a difference in the way that the other person processes it. I mean, a lot of times I think we get into conversations or disputes with the object of winning, of saying, I'm gonna prove this person wrong. I'm gonna beat
Right.
this person. I don't know that there's anything that ever comes out of that that's any good. I think you have to get into it with a really different kind of objective. And in order to do that, sometimes you just gotta stop and think. Think of how often stopping and thinking would have saved an embarrassing moment for someone on social media. It's a great tool, but you have to be thoughtful about it, and especially if what you're trying to do is establish actual dialogue.
And let me jump in here, and just a little off subject, but it popped in my head. Don't assume you hate someone you don't know. And I'll get that over and over again. I get it in person. Oh, I hate you. I'm like, really? You don't know me? You hate my political views. You hate my viewpoints. You hate what I write. But do you really hate me? Do you know me well enough to hate me? We've never met. And I'll tell a story at the very, very beginning of this relationship. Steve and I were in a bar on Mackinac during the Republican State Convention. And these two very strident ladies whom I knew came up, and I had been talking with Steve. When I walked away, they were right in my face. How could you talk to him? How could you be friends with him? He's awful. And I said, do you know, we hate him, is what they said. I said, do you know Steve? They said, no, we never met him. I said, let me challenge you to go over there and spend just a few minutes getting to know him, just talking to him. It's 2 hours later, I had to pull them apart. They come away and say, oh, he's so wonderful. And they still didn't disagree with him, but they took the time to find that he was somebody beyond his political views. He was a person, and people are not their politics.
Yeah.
They're just not.
So we have a bunch of really great questions. I want to make sure we get them in. So
Yep.
Kayetta asked, what are some things you can do when you know the other person is not listening for an understanding, but just for the opportunity to respond?
That's a good one. I would say, listen to them, let them talk out, and then just say, now I've listened to you, now I want you to listen to me. And I've heard people say that so many times, and we've said it to each other. I've let you speak, now please listen to me. And it works sometimes.
Yeah. Also, repeating back to someone what they've said, right? To acknowledge that you're listening to them, right?
Yeah.
Here's what I hear you saying, before you start to say what you say. Sometimes that disarms the sort of confrontational or contentious approach, and people start to listen a little more than they're actually talking.
So the next question we have is, you guys mentioned trying to let it not get personal, but has there been a time that it has gone too far or gotten personal, and how did you overcome that?
That's an interesting question. I don't know.
I don't recall it.
I don't think we've ever gotten to the point. I mean, there have been times when we have really gotten into it. I mean, on television in particular, on the show that we both are on Detroit Public Television, there have been times when it's gotten really, really heated. I'm trying to think of a specific.
Well, there'd be a couple, I recall a few times, I can't recall the actual, where Steve will say like, you conservatives or you Republicans are all like that. Then I know it's starting to get a little personal when he says that. And I'm sure I've done the same the other way. And then you recognize it, you hear it in your voice, you hear what you're saying, and you check that. Because when you start to categorize an individual as the group you perceive they belong to and assign the individual these group characteristics, you know you've crossed into an unhealthy place.
That's right.
Interesting. That's so cool. So the next question is, how do you handle the tense conversation if you're in a professional setting in a meeting with other people?
Mm.
Wow.
Yeah, that's interesting. Go ahead, Steve.
You know, again, I think all of these sort of approaches work in most of these situations. Again, thinking before you respond, thinking about not just how you want to respond, but how you want to move the conversation forward, right? I mean, so often we think, I'm just going to tell that person something and put them in their place or shut them up or prove to them that I understand this better than they do. And I think those are the kinds of instincts that lead you to just more confrontation. Instead, thinking of, all right, this person's saying something I don't agree with or I find offensive, and I need to move the conversation somewhere else. So what is the thing that I say that does that, rather than, and sometimes it is not just slapping at the other person. Sometimes it is not trying to prove that person to be less intelligent or less informed. Sometimes it is acknowledging, hey, I hear what you're trying to say here, but have you thought of it this way? Or here's how I feel about it. I think in a lot of instances that helps diffuse it. It helps, I mean, again, taking the personal stakes out of it, which is not the same as taking your personal opinion out of it. I mean, you want to be saying what you believe and you want to be standing up for the things that you believe, but you don't want to be involved in conversations where somebody's going to have to lose, where somebody has to feel like they were vanquished or completely dismissed. Finding a way to respect the other person, even if it's something that you just can barely countenance. It leads to the possibility for people to understand each other. And again, that's hard because people say stuff sometimes and you're like, I have to get back at that. I gotta slap that down. You want to resist that instinct and think further out. What's the relationship I need or want with this person? And what's the thing I can say that preserves that while still making it clear that I don't agree, that I think this is wrong or just not the way I see it.
If it's in a professional setting, I'm just curious, would it be appropriate to say something to diffuse it at that moment and then invite the person for a longer conversation later when it's just the two of you?
That's probably true. I mean, I think anybody in a position to do so should be fostering a environment in the professional setting where it's okay to have contentious conversations without thinking, gosh, if I say this, I'm going to be out on the street with a sign that says we'll work for food. You know, you want to foster an environment where you can have some heat in order to get to, you know, a point of agreement, because sometimes to get to that point of consensus, you've got to have some heat first, because very rarely two people come into a negotiation in the same place. So, you know, you've got to learn to listen and to converse to get to that point you're trying to get to.
So Lolita has a question. It has a couple of parts to it. So she's asking questions in the heated moment, like, why do you feel that way? Is that appropriate when you're in a sort of hostile conversation, or should you focus more on building the relationship and then continue those conversations once you have more of that foundation built?
Well, it's easier. I mean, that's our recommendation. Get to know people first, particularly if they're people you care about or think you will care about.
Mm-hmm.
Get to understand them first. Get to understand what their hot buttons are, what you don't want to push, but also establish that foundation of trust first.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. You have no shot at building the kind of trust if it comes out of contention. I mean, you need to find opportunities away from that heat to be able to build the relationship in the first place, so that you can talk about these things that are more difficult, and talk about them in a way that moves them forward, as opposed to sort of sticking to that idea of difference or contention.
So Matt asked a question. He said, wondering about your take from a journalistic point of view, if you see the news media shifting to a more op-ed type of reporting to fill the 24/7 news cycle, and if so, do you think this helps fuel some of the hostility in times of crisis?
Oh, absolutely. I think cable news has been, and now internet, these internet news stations, they have settled on this strategy of appealing, of carving out niches. I'm going to appeal to conservatives. I'm going to appeal to liberals. And, it's a lot different than the media environment that Steve and I came into as young people. And it's been, I think, a detriment not only to journalism, but to our civility as a whole in our society, because the vitriol that comes out of these electronic news outlets, just not helpful. And it's not honest, and it's not getting us anywhere,
Yeah, the idea that that there is something to talk about in the news 24 hours a day is really kind of ridiculous if you think about it. And the proof is that if you watch those stations, so often they're just kind of fueling again, confrontation. They're just fanning the flames of dissent among different populations, and it is confusing, I think, also to consumers. I do watch a lot of CNN, which I think is still the more neutral of the three major cable news networks, although Nolan's shaking his head. See, that's something we disagree about right there. But it has lost that idea of clearly defining who's reporting the news and who's expressing an opinion, and it has lost the idea of balance. Their idea of balance often is really, really off. The last time before the pandemic, we had Democratic presidential primaries. I can't remember which states they were. They had a whole panel of people on CNN talking about the results, and there were 10 people on the panel, first of all, which I just don't understand how that makes a lot of sense. But there was one person who would have identified as a conservative. That was Rick Santorum, former senator from Pennsylvania. Everybody else was at least identified as Democratic, if not further left-leaning, and there was no effort to distinguish between somebody like Rick Santorum, who's a politician, and Jennifer Granholm was on the panel. She's a former politician, and the people who are journalists there at the station. It was like everyone's just up there together and everyone's just talking. I think that doesn't serve the public as well as, drawing those lines and saying this person is representing a political party and an ideology, and that's their job, and there's nothing wrong with that. But that's different from Wolf Blitzer, who's sitting here as, as one of our journalists, or some of the journalists who are covering the campaign. who they have on those panels. And I think you see that on all the stations. I'm a little more shocked, I guess, when I see that on CNN. I expect that from MSNBC on the left. I expect that from Fox on the right. Those are networks that have much more transparent political points of view, but you see it everywhere right now. And I do think it's
Yeah.
necessary.
And it's distressing because if you're just looking for objective coverage, the facts, and I think in this time of crisis, a lot of us just want the facts. We don't want the spin. We don't want the finger pointing. We just want to know what's going on and how to protect ourselves. And there's so few places you can find that. And you got to blame yourself as news consumers too, because we do tend to gravitate to outlets that affirm our opinions. And I think we want to be aware of that. But right now, I wouldn't know where to tell you to go if you just wanted straight up objective reporting. I believe a 24-hour news channel that did that said, hey, we're dropping the spin. We don't belong to either political party. We're just going to tell you what's going on, just like you used to get when we were growing up from the broadcast stations, the broadcast news. I mean, they were very careful to be, they peel a mass audience. They had to be somewhere in the middle in their reporting. And man, it'd be nice to have that again.
It would. So we have about 5 minutes left. I just wonder if you guys would like to conclude with any last thoughts or any last topics we want to make sure we introduce.
We haven't really talked about how people can do this, right? Like, how do you start this, or how do you find the opportunity to build this kind of relationship or dialogue? And I would say that workplaces, even though they can be fraught with lots of other kinds of dynamics and politicking, I actually think they're productive places to be able to do this. This is where we spend so much of our time, and trying to build relationships with people who are different from us, who come from different backgrounds, who might believe different things, I think is easier, or it's just more accessible in that environment. And so I think the idea of seeking it out, right, of trying to find the opportunity to do it, and doing it in a way that is about building the relationship first, rather than picking a fight, is one of the things that I think is pretty important. I mean, it's one of the opportunities that we have to be able to do that.
I would start in your own families first, because we all have, particularly since the last election, you remember, we talked about, people can't have Thanksgiving dinner together. I was in Kentucky 2 or 3 Easter Sundays ago, and my brother-in-law come charging in the house, sat down and said, I don't want anybody here to mention Donald Trump. This is my last chance at Easter dinner. He'd already been run off from 2 other family gatherings. And, start with your own family. And if there are people there you've sort of been estranged from because of your political leanings and this disrespect you might have developed because of that, start there. Those are the people you know best. But I would say do the exercise Steve and I have done with other groups. We haven't been able to do it here because of the social distancing, but when this is over, find somebody you think you'd like to know and you think you'd like to have a friendship with, a relationship with, but you're afraid that politics separate you. And go out, have a drink, have a coffee, and start with this idea of, why do you think the things you do? You think differently than I do. Why? What shapes your opinion making? What are your values that you are applying here? And I think you'll find it very interesting and very enlightening.
Well, this is great. Thank you so much, everybody, for participating. Thank you, Delta Dental, not only for hosting this, but for sponsoring the Civility Project. And then Susie mentioned that you find Civility by not being afraid to take the first step. and opening yourself up in these situations with honesty and effort. So Susie, that's a great way for us to end the session. Thank you for contributing that. Really appreciate it. Stephen and Nolan, thank you so much for giving us your time today. And
Thank you all.
yeah. All right.
Thank you.
Everyone, have a great day
Nice
and
way
stay
to
healthy.
learning.
Thank you.
Thank you.